Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Melinda Nusafora. A standoff between Russia and Ukraine is threatening to boil over into the worst escalation of tensions since 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. The Ukrainian government has blasted Russia's seizure of 3 of its ships and its crew as a clear act of aggression. But Russia maintains that Ukraine violated its territory and hinted that Kiev orchestrated the crisis for political purposes. The incident was sparked on November 25th near the Kerch Strait when Russian naval vessels fired on and then seized 3 Ukrainian ships and 24 sailors. Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko called on NATO to deploy naval ships to the Sea of Azov to provide security in the hotly contested waters. While blaming Russia for the tensions, German Chancellor Angela Merkel stopped short of showing solidarity with Kiev. She rebuffed pleas for NATO's assistance, saying there is no military solution to the current crisis. Meanwhile, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has offered to play a mediating role, saying he spoke to the leaders of both Ukraine and Russia about de-escalating tensions. And joining me now to discuss this in greater detail is Halil Akunca, who was a former Turkish ambassador to Russia, and Hakan Akbaş, who was a senior advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group in Turkey. Gentlemen, thank you for being here on Straight Talk. Halil, we're going to start with you. Ambassador, Ukraine has requested NATO support in the Black Sea region, but so far NATO has resisted those calls. How does instability in that region affect all the other countries bordering the Black Sea?
Well, you know, NATO is already there. There are 3 riparian states which are members of NATO. Romania, Bulgaria and Turkey. So NATO is there.
But they are saying they don't want to deploy any ships, they don't want to increase their presence.
You have the Montreal Convention, which limits the number of Navy vessels that could enter and stay in the Black Sea. And this Montreal Convention has preserved stability, has maintained stability over now, how many years? 1936 to today.
Do you think if this instability continues, though, it could harm trade, the economies of those border regions? Or do you think this is just going to play out between Russia and Ukraine?
You know, this is not the first misunderstanding or first clash between Ukraine and Russia. You know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they thought that in 1991, Yeltsin thought that there will be a union would continue with the membership of Belarus and Ukraine, 2 other Slav countries. Now, he failed to achieve that. But the Russian psychology never considers Ukraine as something different from Russia, as some being different from Russia. Because in the 19th century, the Ukrainians used to call themselves real Russians, and the Russians, not real Slavs, because they have been mixing with Turks for over 1,000 years. So later you have Ukrainian nationalism, but they have always considered Russians, always Ukrainians, as their brothers. So loss of Ukraine was not very acceptable to them. And then, you know, Lugansk and other areas, and Crimea also. Crimea, they took Crimea from us. 1774. 1778, they annexed Crimea. Now the border between the Ottoman Empire and the annexed Crimea in 1778 was Taman Peninsula on our side and Crimea on the other side, Kerch. Kerch was the border.
If we just move forward in history to what Erdogan has offered now, he's saying he's willing to be a mediator between both sides. Do you think Turkey could be an effective mediator, and how do you see that role playing out?
Now, you know, they are not talking to each other, which they should do, as NATO Secretary General urged them. And the others, Americans also, they said they should talk to each other. Now, Erdogan is on good terms. Our President Erdogan is on good terms with Poroshenko and Putin. So he could at least play a useful role in conveying each other's views to the other.
Hakan, I'm going to bring you in here to broaden this out a little bit more and take a look at how this is potentially something to do with Ukrainian politics. Now, we've got Ukraine imposing martial law in 10 of its 25 provinces. Now, there are some critics of President Poroshenko who say that this is just a move to delay or generate more support ahead of the March 31 elections. What do you make of those claims?
I would certainly tend to agree with you because certainly nationalism and populism tend to pay off at the polls. And I don't think Poroshenko would be an exception as a leader. And martial law would certainly give him too much power going forward. And even this crisis may have been sort of escalated by Poroshenko because we have this G20 summit going on where Putin will be attending along with President Erdogan as well as Mr. Trump. So this may not be a pure coincidence in my mind. So it will be all about making sure that the world will see sort of the evil and aggressive Putin on the world stage.
So it's timing and it's optics.
Yes.
What about the fact that, okay, we've got critics have argued that US President Donald Trump, he continues to be embroiled in political and potential legal troubles at home, and with NATO largely divided, is that giving Putin a sense that he can act aggressively, he's a bit more emboldened, and he can do things like this in the Kerch Strait because everyone else is busy dealing with their own fires at home?
That appears to be the case so far, and with Brexit as well as Mr. Trump becoming the president, certainly we are seeing big cracks within the Western alliance. And obviously, Mr. Trump's America First policy is more interested in keeping his checks and balances on the NATO in terms of why am I paying all this money to defend you, EU, while you have all these surpluses and while I have $1 trillion deficit. So, and the second, obviously, what is going on within EU, all the nationalist sort of governments keep getting elected, and the Brexit obviously is creating a golden opportunity for Mr. Putin to become more aggressive. And we've seen this movie in Georgia, we've seen this movie in the Baltic Sea, as well as the border of the Eastern Europe, and now we're seeing it in Ukraine. And really the country that will mobilize NATO and bring the deterrence and the credibility back is US, and we do not see that leadership right now with Mr. Trump.
Hello, what do you think about that? You've met Putin on several occasions. Do you think that he is feeling emboldened to carry out this kind of action because there are fractures in that Western alliance?
Well, you know, when Putin decides on something, he'll just go ahead. He'll just go ahead. He decided to annex Crimea, and he has done so. If you remember, in 2013, they had an agreement over entrance and exit to and from Kerch Strait, that no naval vessels would be, foreign naval vessels would be allowed. Anyway, it's too shallow for big ships to enter. That's another fact. Geography prevents it. And just annex Crimea. Just annex Crimea. And then they started building the bridge in 2003, preparations for the bridge. Not 13, in 2003. There is an island, Tuzla. Turkish, name is Turkish. And then they filled the sea from the shore of Taman Peninsula to Tuzla. And then later they built, by the way, do you know who built the first bridge? A colleague of mine reminded me, Hitler. Over the Kerch Strait in 1943. It was a suspended bridge.
Oh, it's a similarity that I'm sure he doesn't really want to draw.
No, it's not similar. But he's just going ahead, and he calculates the reaction of the West. And Putin prefers to deal with individual countries of the West rather than institutions of the West. So Merkel said, after a telephone conversation, Merkel said, well, she doesn't believe in sanctions, which is true, by the way.
So it'll be interesting at the G20 summit. Hakan, let me ask you. President Trump has cancelled his scheduled meeting with Vladimir Putin at the G20. What kind of diplomatic fallout do you think we can expect to see in the coming days and weeks? And could this complicate Turkey's cooperation with Russia in places like Syria?
And just like everybody else, Mr. Putin also has come to find out about it via Twitter. And this is probably a first ever. And obviously, Mr. Trump had to cancel because he was avoiding press briefings given what's going on in Washington following this Mueller investigation, with now his former lawyer basically admitting to the fact that he had private meetings, secret meetings with Mr. Putin's press secretary and his team right before he was to be nominated as the next US president from his party. So that's a big deal. Obviously, at the G20, he's doing whatever he can to avoid any confrontation at home, and that includes canceling Mr. Putin's meeting as well as with President Erdogan and other leaders. So this was not something against Turkey, but overall he had to do that. Obviously, that will likely help Turkey because so far, for example, in our southern border, our policy at least has been to maneuver on the field as well as diplomatically, for example, in Idlib with Russia and Putin, and in Manbij, Mr. Trump and the US. So I think the more they divert, I think the more Turkey and President Erdogan will have a better chance to really play the diplomacy as well as trying to reconcile the parties, both on the ground at the diplomatic levels. Having said that, we need to watch very closely what's going to happen at home in Washington.
That's it. They've all got domestic fires to put out, so it will be interesting to see how it progresses. Hakan Akbaş and former Ambassador Khalil Akunca, thank you both very much for being here on Straight Talk. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's multi-nation tour to South America is set to push forward one of the country's main foreign policy goals, a multilateral approach that will expand trade and political ties to regions far from Turkey's backyard. And that policy is generating the type of growth that will provide great opportunities for Turkish companies seeking new markets. James Kim explains.
It's a conversation starter for many South Americans when the topic of Turkey comes up. Like tens of millions of others across the world, South Americans have also fallen in love with Turkish TV dramas. And that popularity is translating into real numbers. More than 165,000 tourists from South America have visited Turkey so far this year, up 70% from 2017. It provides an opening to expand a relationship already built on a foundation of cultural goodwill. Energy, trade, and strategic partnerships are all likely to be on the agenda during Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's multi-nation trip to South America. His visits to Argentina, Paraguay, and Venezuela will touch on all those subjects, as the continent's status as a growing market, as well as a source for raw materials, continues to attract Turkish companies. But it's Turkey's relations with Venezuela and its leader, Nicolas Maduro, that many analysts have been watching closely. Maduro has endured economic troubles at home, which has fueled violent protests against his government. And Venezuela's troubled relationship with its largest export market, the United States, has only worsened the situation.
Against Venezuela.
Much like his countrymen who are shying away from America's cultural influence, Maduro is also searching for alternatives when it comes to trade and strategic partners. Having already visited Turkey 4 times in just 2 years, Maduro has lavished compliments on Erdogan, even tweeting a message back in July praising him as a leader of the new multipolar world.
So Maduro is really looking for new allies, and Turkey, as a country that has come under the criticism of a number of Western governments, became a rather good ally for the Venezuelan regime. So that's why Maduro is increasingly looking to the Turkish government for diplomatic support, for political support, as well as better economic ties.
But this economic relationship has been upended by the United States, whose attempts at isolating Maduro is now directly affecting Turkey's trade relations. In July, Venezuela's mining minister, Victor Cano, said the country's gold was being sent to Turkey for refining to avoid the risk of being seized by European nations which are cooperating with U.S. sanctions. U.S. President Donald Trump responded in kind by authorizing new sanctions on Venezuela's gold sector. It was a move to disrupt a lucrative lifeline that U.S. officials fear is undermining efforts to pressure Maduro.
This dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro
And with the U.S. considering adding Venezuela to its list of state sponsors of terrorism, Turkey will be put in a tighter spot of choosing between old and new allies. James Kim, Straight Talk.
Okay, let's break down what's behind Turkey's economic and strategic relationship with Venezuela and the region as a whole. Joining me is Kerch, a former Turkish ambassador to Mexico, and Javier Faje, who is a political analyst and former editor of the UK-based news outlet, the Latin America Bureau. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us on Straight Talk. Aleph, I'm going to start with you first. Let's talk purely economics for the first question. How lucrative is the Latin American market for Turkey?
It is getting to be an expanding market, both for Latin Americans and for Turkey. It is, let me put it this way, an untapped market up till now by states outside maybe some European countries and the United States. So it is opening up to the world, not only to Turkey, but Turkey is also very much interested in getting a share there.
And specifically, what is this untapped market? You know, what are we seeing being the sort of lucrative industries?
Well, we talk of globalization in our time, and globalization is expanding to the world. And South America, Latin America, has never had this chance until very recently. I mean, it was more or less a very closed domain to certain countries. And now, expanding to the world, it is both in itself creating opportunities and receiving opportunities from abroad. And Turkey is one such recipient and donor country.
Mm-hmm. Turkey and Latin America have had diplomatic relations for a very long time, but why now are we seeing this very definite push into Latin America? Why now?
Well, for one thing, Turkey's diplomatic representation in Latin America was until very recently confined only to 6 embassies. And if I should count them, one was Cuba, one was Mexico, okay, then the 4 in South America, Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. So only in the past, let me say, 20 years have we expanded our presence in South America, in Latin America. It has more than doubled our representation in the past 10 years. And I would all attach this to the recent concept of globalization.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right, Javier, I'm going to bring you in here because there's no doubt that while there are economic benefits, this is also a strategic partnership that we're seeing developing here. Now, President Erdogan is due to arrive in Venezuela on Monday. A lot of Western powers are moving away from Venezuela, and they've been very critical of President Nicolas Maduro's government there. Turkey's moving in the opposite direction. Turkey's foreign minister has even described the two presidents as being like brothers. Why? Why is Turkey taking a different stance?
First of all, both President Maduro and President Erdogan have been the target of hostility from the US. That creates a bond between heads of the states who feel that they are being bullied by a big boy, if you like. So that creates a sort of a bond. But also, many people don't realize that there's a lot of investments, Turkish investments in Venezuela, which enable Venezuela also to benefit. Turkish companies invest in Venezuela, sort of working with natural resources, and they are allowed to keep 70% of the profit and 30% stay with the state in Venezuela. But how does the Venezuelan state benefit? By the building of infrastructure by Turkish companies. Venezuela needs that infrastructure to break the cycle of dependency from oil exports to start creating self-sufficient produce, especially in the agricultural sector. So there is a practical reason why Turkey is supporting President Maduro, but also we mustn't forget this. Not all Western countries have been hostile. Portugal has just signed an agreement with Venezuela, Holland as well. Now, basically, but the other reason is that Venezuela has the biggest reserves of oil on the planet. That is a future investment for whoever decides to work with Venezuela. In relation to Maduro's legitimacy, well, there are many questions about whether the elections were fair enough, but the opposition never show any proof that these elections were rigged. And we mustn't forget that President Maduro lost a great deal of support. Fewer people voted for him than they did in the last election. So it's not as if everything is perfect there. So it makes perfect sense for President Erdogan to defy the US by investing in Venezuela, because they are both benefiting with this.
Do you think that there is a large part of their relationship is this desire to defy America? Is it symbolic as well?
I think it's more than symbolic. It is practical as well because of this exchange, between Venezuela and Turkey.
But do you think that's an attractive
It does create a bond between two leaders who are being harassed by the US. Don't forget what happened in August this year with the sanctions imposed by the US, and never mind the sanctions that have been imposed on Venezuela in the last few years. So yes, that has created the need of strategic alliances among people who have been affected by what they consider bullying from the big north. So in that respect, yes, it is crucial in terms of the kind of relationship that President Erdogan has with President Maduro.
Alev, one of Venezuela's main exports, apart from oil, as Javier mentioned, is gold. And the US has recently sanctioned the country's gold sector. But the US is also considering adding Venezuela to the state sponsors of terrorism list. How do you see those two issues affecting Turkey's relationship with Venezuela and the region as a whole?
Okay. For one thing, I would not define the Turkish-Venezuela relations from the basis or perspective of a negative notion of defiance of a third country. It is more joint common interests that bind together. And saying this, I also would like to point out at the fact that Turkey's relations with many South American, Latin American countries are developing immensely. For instance, what would be unthought of, let's say, a couple of years ago, we have now what is called strategic partnerships with Mexico, with Brazil. So, and again, a wide network of relations in all of Latin America, South America, okay? So Venezuela maybe has now given the opportunity, being an isolated country, I mean isolated by the United States, isolated by a number, so it is for Turkey an easier access when the circumstances permit to go into Venezuela. And Turkey, in my view, Turkey makes use of this irrespective of the political implications, or not because of the political scene there.
But if the US is imposing sanctions in Venezuela, Turkey and the US are also NATO allies. They need to remain on good terms. How does Turkey balance those two competing relationships?
Well, this is a good question in the sense that we face similar things, for instance, with Iran, and we somehow come over that with sensitive approaches both to the United States and to Iran. And I think a similarity can be drawn between how we approach Venezuela, not necessarily defying the United States, but also getting to the fore or making more prominent the economic aspect of these relations.
Javier, what do you think about that? How does Turkey, or how should Turkey, balance their two competing relationships here?
Well, it's perfectly possible because, as the ambassador said earlier, the level of trade between Turkey and Latin America has increased from, in the year 2006, from 3.4 billion to almost 10 billion in 2017. There's a huge increase in this relationship. That is very important for the economy, both of the region as well as the economy of Turkey. At the same time, we mustn't forget that Turkey already has a free trade agreement with Chile, and they are negotiating with, I think, Mexico and I think, Peru,
about 5
and
other
Ecuador.
countries at the moment.
So
yes.
those free trade agreements will enable Turkey to break any kind of blockade that the Americans may want to impose. At the same time, by doing that, they have the freedom to negotiate and trade with those countries who will not have any problem in doing that with Turkey. But at the same time, in the case of Venezuela, I agree with the ambassador, we shouldn't try to find the negative side of that alliance, but also how they both benefit in this particular. Listen, when the US sneezes, the developing world catches a cold. During the August fall of the lira, of the Turkish lira, Latin American currencies suffer as a result of this situation. So this strategic alliance between Latin America and Turkey is important to prevent these things from happening again. So this, when the Americans sanctioned Turkey and the Turkish economy suffered, Latin American economy suffered. So President Erdogan, I would imagine, would try to discuss a strategic alliance with Latin America to make sure that if something happens, if the Americans decide to have a go again at Turkey, this will not affect the economies of both Turkey and Latin America. So this is a strategic alliance among developing economies who suffer the consequences of the problems that happen in the rich north will have to be discussed. And I think that's why I find the value of President Erdogan not only to visit to Latin America, but also specifically to Venezuela.
They are going to be some very robust discussions, and we look forward to hearing what comes out of them. Gentlemen, both thank you for being here and discussing these issues here on Straight Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Melinda Nusafora. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with the hashtag Straight Talk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.